Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. The end of Friday. I hope everyone's had a good couple days at Change Now. I am very happy to be back for this edition. Can you hear me? Okay. Very happy to be back for this edition of Change Now. It's been 3 years since I was last here, and it's really wonderful to see how the event has grown and how much has changed. I am very thrilled to talk today about climate change, which we all know is happening and is accelerating very quickly. And the panel today is actually talking more about saying this has a huge impact in terms of cost, in terms of people on society. So this session is about managing our new reality. How do we adjust to this changing world in which there are more frequent disasters and more frequent issues? We have a wonderful panel, 2 panels, and a wonderful key speaker, all women today. And I'm very pleased to present our first speaker, who is a breathtaking woman, Ms. Runa. She's the founder of Friendship. For anyone who doesn't know Friendship, you'll see some images, but it is a massive humanitarian effort in Bangladesh. She reaches 7.5 million people per year with the provision of basic services in areas that are normally not reached. She has become also an incredible voice on the international stage of bridging between local crises and international actors. And through her advocacy, work has become a global phenomenon. She has won numerous awards. She is an Ashoka Fellow. She is a member of the Schwab Foundation, the Club of Rome, and on numerous boards. She is a truly breathtaking woman. Please welcome Ms. Runa.
Thank you. Dear. Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm really happy and honored to be here today. Good afternoon, and it's my privilege to be able to share 23 years of dealing with disasters daily. The picture you see behind me, it's not a picture of a child trying to jump into the water for swimming. It's a picture of Joshim. Joshim is a child who's wanting to go back home. The water that he's trying to jump in, it's the water which had his home. Beneath the water was his home, the season prior to what you see now. He was trying to go in, and his father was trying to pull him back from jumping into the water. This is the human side of disaster. I come from Bangladesh, one of the most climate-impacted countries and nations on this planet. A country of river and resilience, both. For over 2 decades, Friendship has been working with communities which are unseen not only by the world, but unseen by the people many people who are living in the cities, in the villages, even in rural areas of Bangladesh. These are nomadic islands, what you see here. The river Brahmaputra can be 30 kilometers across. It can hold the city of Paris in between. It's made of silt, the earth of Bangladesh. And climate change, though geography and climate has been impacting the people like this for centuries, but demography and the climate change within the last 25 years has exacerbated everything that is happening to the country and to these people and community. Migration used to be like, there are people who have migrated 4 times, but there are people 4 times in 1 year, and then there are people who have migrated maybe 48 times in their lifetime, losing their homes every time. And then we realize that about 80% of the times have been over the last 25, 30 years. So it's not only demography, it is not only how the country is, but this is climate change in reality that is touching their lives. And globally also, we are seeing this displacement. More than 32.6 million people, which is actually have been displaced, which is actually 3 times more than any conflict. In South Asia alone, 2.5 million people have been displaced with floods and cyclones. And the future is even more staggering because the UN has come up with a figure which is by 2050, there's going to be 1.2 billion people who will be displaced due to climate change. And most will be from the global south. They are no longer remaining internally displaced. They are becoming climate refugees. UNHCR is still not accepting them, calling them climate refugees. They're still internally displaced people, but they are breaking boundaries, and they are breaking man-made boundaries of this world. We are in a country, where disasters are no longer a singular event. It is being, the whole country is being like overlapping, accelerating the impact which is also exacerbated by the political atmosphere of our regions, many of the areas of the south. And one of the clearest and most complex example of compounded disaster is what happened to the Rohingya refugees. So 1 million people came across the border and across to Bangladesh from Myanmar, staying in an area, coming into an area which was actually the green belt of Bangladesh, which was totally deforested, and this was slightly hilly. So you can understand when the floods came, the landslides happening, and this was also a biodiversity impact because these were all tracks of the elephant movement. So all that was totally cut off. So human, political, climate, the interlink is immense. Since 23 years, Friendship, and an organization I founded, has been trying to find help, care, and solutions. Prioritizing adaptation because immediate needs need to be addressed simultaneously with solutions which we foresee in the future. It is easy to say that we need adaptation before mitigation, but in reality, we need everything together. In reality, we need the advocates as we need those people working on the ground. I have a short 2-minute video, which I would like you to watch with some of the works that we are doing. For 23 years, I started working with climate migrants. Besides the Rohingya refugees, our core work is always with the climate migrants. Thank you. I should move, let me see. Yeah. you. The responsibility of the giver is as much as the responsibility of those who receive. Because climate crisis is something which is a very, for the people who are suffering, it is extremely critical. We have to continuously ensure that we do not take away the human dignity and their self-respect, because that could be at stake because of the way that you give. Every migration needs health, home, livelihood, socio-economic, and understanding of the political ecosystem that they find themselves as. When the Rohingyas had come, the crisis, we needed to ensure not only relief, but we needed to ensure that when we gave them compassion, and we gave them enough support so that they could start rebuilding their lives to feel secured. That is what was needed for the political refugees. We also, with PSG and Klabu, have a sports club, and the women has won the award. This is important because, when we try to give them something, and we give them something which is taking away their dignity, it takes years to rebuild this, especially in a political disaster. Then comes the natural disasters. In the natural disasters, what Friendship has done, migrants are moving continuously. You need to give them a platform on which they can grow. And to give them this platform, certainly when you're suffering, health is primary. So we started a 3-tier healthcare system, which is continuously serving, even there are hospital ships. We have 7 hospital ships, 2 land hospitals, community clinics, which are all mobile, community aids that we have taught, and they go around ensuring that no one falls through the gap, either the child's immunization, cervical cancer follow-ups, or cold cases of things like fistulas or prolapsed uteruses, which take 1 or 2 hours only to operate, but we give back life to them. Then we try to link them and to ensure that they have education, which brings hope. We try to ensure that agriculture and livelihood is brought to their doorstep. But in the end, we need to also ensure that they have continuity of the services that we give. And therefore, we train. We train people in community-initiated disaster risk resilience. This is extremely important because sooner or later, they will find themselves alone. And how can they restart their life if they do not have dignity? And I will tell you how important this is. The DG of Education in Bangladesh went to one of our schools, in this area. And he asked a child of grade 9, what is it that keeps you from restarting your life or to reach your goals? And he said that I thought they're going to tell me poverty, or they're going to say it's inaccessibility. But you know what he said? He said, courage. Courage is what keeps us from not reaching out to do what we have to do. So it is courage that for every disaster we need to touch the lives with. Natural disaster. And then you have disasters like what we had at COVID. During the time of COVID, the world stood still. Preparedness is one of the keys to being able to deal with disaster. Preparing the people before the disaster strikes. Because except for a tsunami or except for an earthquake, there are many disasters which are kind of predictable, and we have to prepare the people. Because if adaptation solution means that they know not at that moment receiving a solution, but how they are going to receive that solution when they have migrated. During COVID, I remember even before the Bangladesh government had announced that COVID was in Bangladesh, I got this feeling I need to protect the people who are working in the front line. How do I protect them? So I bought masks, PPPs, gloves, much before the government did, all at a very good price, I can tell you, and medicines, all kinds of medicines. And our staff was working in the front line 1 month before even WHO had put PPPs on their staff. People were laughing, saying, why are you doing this? And what they said was, it is because our organization has told us to do so. And here is where I think fundamentally the most important thing about disaster comes. Disaster mitigation, how you handle disaster. It is the trust in the organization. It is the trust in the leadership. Unless my staff had trusted me and went ahead in doing what we all wanted to do in the end, we would have had deaths. 7,500 staff of Friendship and their community and their families, not one person died from COVID. And, and this was really, really, I felt that this was the depth of trust in leadership. You cannot make a journey of working with disaster if you are alone. You need to embrace that your whole organization needs to be together on the same wavelength, ensuring that verity, dignity, transparency, the quality of the service you give them, and the values you give to them and the hope you give to them continues. If this doesn't happen, it is extremely difficult to deal with sudden disasters. For sudden disasters, which we all have, it is a journey of togetherness. It's a journey of trust. And it is a journey of ensuring that those who work with you come together and you take the path of a solution which you believe in. Ensuring human dignity, human hope is not touched upon. I end with a little story. Time over. I end with a little story. When we have volunteers working with us, and I have to speak to them, hundreds of young volunteers come for a crisis. I tell them that be very careful when you give a bag of rice or a sack of clothing to someone who is impacted. You give it with a lot of respect. Because if you do not, you are taking away their self-respect and dignity, which they cannot, and you are taking far more than what you are giving to them. And this is something, all of us have dealt with disasters, I'm sure. This is something that we need to ensure the lives we touch are left better than what we leave them. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, yes. Hi, everyone. Now we're ready for our first panel. I'm very pleased to welcome on the stage Lauren Carter and Karina Whalley. We're here to talk about a very interesting topic today, insurance. But it actually is a really interesting topic when looking at crisis. And what we actually want to talk about today is how countries, how cities can prepare for climate-related issues, knowing that there's a growing number of them in the world. I'm very pleased today to have Lauren Carter, who co-leads the UNDP's insurance team, and Karina Whalley, who is responsible for public sector at AXA Insurance. So it's to give some context. Lauren, how is the UNDP actually working with insurers?
So the UN works with insurers in a variety of different ways, which I think is a bit unusual because the UN isn't known for effective public-private partnerships. We don't usually work with the private sector, but our team works with the insurance industry in a variety of different platforms. So one of these is this tripartite agreement that's a partnership with AXA and also 19 other insurers. And the goal of that is to develop sovereign, so country level or municipal climate risk solutions using insurance and leveraging UNDP's kind of governance and sustainability mechanisms. We also have bilateral partnerships with insurers, such as Generali, where we work to build tools such as SME loss prevention frameworks to help incentivize risk reduction. And then we also have these things called innovation challenges. And that's where we actually put money out into the market to incentivize insurers to fill previously underserved market gaps by creating products such as for women entrepreneurs in Uganda or health insurance products in Tanzania, and actually give them the financing and technical assistance to be able to build products to meet that need. So we work with insurers in a variety of different ways, but all of them are very market driven, and I think that's sort of a unique selling proposition of the work that we're doing today.
Yeah, and being the bridge basically between the public and private sector so that players like AXA can actually access public sector players, which is also not your traditional bedfellow. Okay, so Karina, how do insurers fit into this picture?
Well, I was meeting some people at the conference and they were a bit surprised to have insurance and climate in the same sentence. So just to give some context of why insurance actually is important for climate risk, there's really 3 levers. The first is that insurers can price risk, and that's really important because when you can price things and measure things, you can manage them. So for instance, I don't know if everyone knows this, but last year, natural disasters cost globally economic losses and damages, and I'm sure this is underestimated, were $320 billion. And that's been going on an upward trend in recent years, obviously because of climate change. The World Bank has actually said that that number is too low. It's actually 520 billion when you take into account human losses and suffering. So being able to
A good thing to take into account.
So that's just, because you're just thinking about assets, but actually there's so much more than assets.
Yeah.
So being able to price that is super important because then you can reduce it, you can figure out how to finance the residual risk, etc. And insurance companies have been building models for decades to actually understand how to put the right price on this. The second lever is really taking the risk. The insurance companies can actually take risk away from individuals, from businesses, from governments in a more cost-efficient way because they're pooling the risk, different types of risks, different territories, they're pooling this globally. So it's much more efficient in terms of how much capital you have to keep aside. And then the last lever is really around investment. So there's $44 trillion in assets under management from the entire insurance industry. And if you could just move a small fraction of that into disaster risk reduction, that would be really powerful. So we're trying to do that at AXA Climate to try and pull those levers as best we can.
44 trillion.
That's 44% of global GDP. That's huge.
Insurers are the second biggest pool of capital after pension funds. So all the premiums that they're collecting, they're investing that money. And how and what they invest in is really going to be a make or break as to whether or not we achieve the Paris Agreement, the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, every major development framework. If we don't get the capital that insurance have as asset managers and asset owners, all of those are not going to happen.
But then what percentage do you know about, more or less, what's actually going into looking at these issues? Do we know?
Not anywhere
enough.
Near what it should.
Much too little. Wow. All right. So let's look at when you all are working together, because now you've done a lot of these projects together. What does that actually look like? Can you give a couple of examples so people have an understanding kind of how it is that the UN and insurers are working together and also with governments to try and protect against climate disasters?
Yeah, so I can take a really tangible example of a partnership that we have through this tripartite agreement, which includes, as we said, AXA, but also other insurance players such as Swiss Re, Howden, Willis Towers, Watson, Generali, Zurich, et cetera. Most of Allianz, most of the big insurance players now globally. And we're working together in about 20 different countries to come up with these climate risk solutions using insurance and embedding that in UNDP's ability to convene governments, bring them together, and also create the kind of legislative and regulatory pathways that actually help these solutions stay in place, and stay in place not just for a moment in time, but ideally in a long-term way. So one of these examples is in Uzbekistan. There was a project or a policy actually that was put in place earlier this month. This is a frost protection policy for Uzbekistan's fruit farmers, and this is actually subsidized now 50% by the local government, and this was enabled through UNDP's support to the government to create the legislation that enables them to give that agricultural subsidy to farmers. Farmers are now buying this insurance through local farmers associations, through local insurers who are backed by the reinsurance capacity of the tripartite partners. And so this is actually giving that financial protection to those climate vulnerable Uzbekistani farmers in that they never had access to that before. Local insurance markets didn't exist in Uzbekistan, but because of the willingness of insurers to come together and apply their risk modeling expertise and develop products for these new markets, for UNDP's ability to work with governments and bring them together to find the ways in which these solutions can actually land and get to people. And frankly, the government's willingness to have that interest and demand to recognize the value that insurance plays in enabling them to safeguard and protect their development gains, because these farmers are very vulnerable to these different risks, and without insurance, the government is the one who's going to have to step in and protect them if something happens.
Yeah.
Or worst case scenario, the government doesn't, and then those people can slide back into poverty, which is obviously not the ideal outcome.
No, and that's already a bit forward thinking, because there's many, many places where the idea of agriculture insurance doesn't exist, or it's so completely out of reach for reality. But we all live from that food as well. You know, this is the fundamental basis of everything. So if we can't get that right, then
the U.S. and Europe are subsidizing, their agricultural industries a lot. So this is, also those countries, in developing countries, they don't have the same, financial backing of governments that the U.S. and Europe do. So this is sort of leveling the playing field as well for them.
Yeah.
But just to say, I think there's also some fantastic examples in emerging countries that have been really pioneering in terms of developing these kind of climate risk schemes. One is in Mexico. So like maybe 20 years ago, they've really developed this public asset insurance scheme where they mapped every single critical asset across all levels of government across the whole country. They set up a natural disaster fund, also set up a prevention fund to try and reduce the risk as much as possible. They did innovative insurance using like really parametric triggers, so based on cyclone and earthquake triggers to release funding very quickly, plus normal insurance for reconstruction. And it's actually been emulated all over the world. So it's not just Europe and US are doing great stuff. It's also in other countries.
Oh, and that's the interest also, is that if you can find these models that work well, that you can copy and paste them in different places, and then you can actually make something that's more functional for a much broader part of the global population. What happens in places where this is not the case? I mean, I think we just heard about Bangladesh, a lot of things that are happening. In the next panel, we'll also talk a lot about places that are not prepared and where there's not insurance. But what happens in the scenario that there isn't actually these kinds of schemes in places? What do you see?
So UNDP has been tracking human development for about 30 years, and that development trajectory has always steadily climbed upwards until COVID. And so because COVID was this big global event that everyone sort of was impacted by, and for 2 years in a row, we saw actual development progress backslide. And what that told us is that development gains are fragile, and that nothing is automatically going, it's not a given that things are always going to get better. Things can get worse, and they can go back to a baseline from where they were. So this showed us that if we aren't protecting and putting in place these shock absorbers, which is essentially what insurance is, to enable people to survive climate shocks, health shocks, business interruption, all the different intersecting crises that are happening today, if we don't put in place the tools and solutions, that development can go backwards. And that's was a very important lesson. And I think that insurance, and not only does it, when it goes backwards, it's very difficult to get back to where you were. If girls get out of school, they don't often go back to school. They often get married young and then,
Continues the entire cycle.
So a lot of times the impacts that happen from these, you don't recover from them the next year. They're often permanent and they often change the trajectory of people's lives. So I think that's the important thing to understand, that these solutions, when they're delivered quickly, effectively, cost efficiently, they can really, at a very human level, keep people's lives in a forward progression.
I think what you're trying. I think one of the ways of seeing it is the cost-benefit ratio, where you say, having early warning systems, having pre-arranged financing like insurance, but also other kind of just financing that's set up in advance that can release money quickly, having contingency plans so everyone knows what to do after a disaster. All of that speeds up the recovery.
Yeah.
And that actually has such a benefit, because if you don't have any of those systems in place and you just wait for a year until everything is fixed, or maybe it never gets fixed, the cost actually explodes.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the ratio is. They've got
about
lots of different studies.
Damage. It's about the human damage. This is the
Exactly,
520 trillion.
But it's also about the compounding impact. So if you've got electricity and water systems that are down for days, weeks, months, you've got all the kind of trickle-on effects that has for the economy and for people. And then so if you count that all up, it's actually much more expensive after all if you just wait for ages to kind of get everything back to normal. So I think those kind of cost-benefit ratios will really help to show how important it is to put that stuff in place now.
Yeah. And I think that forces into another topic that I want to talk about, which is what kind of structures can you put into place, actually? Because we know that the costs of these crises are getting incrementally higher. They're happening more frequently. And that means the check that needs to get written is bigger. The upfront cost is more significant. So how are insurers thinking about this, and how are you working to actually make this something that's accessible?
Well, I think, there's a few different ways that you can minimize. There's a whole lot of different cost structures, cost factors in place that you could squeeze. So one is, for instance, distribution costs. So instead of doing insurance to each different person, you could maybe just have the government as the actual policyholder.
Yeah.
And then you're aggregating the risk, and then they can use their existing structures to actually have that insurance distributed to citizens. So that actually you can really crunch down the distribution costs. Something else would be something like parametric insurance, but I was talking about the Mexican example, where you have actual hazard triggers. So the category of a hurricane will immediately release $200 million to the Mexican government. That will allow costs to be lower, because you're obviously getting money quickly, but then also there's no money spent on having people going on the ground to check how much things cost. That can also squeeze the costs a bit. And then the other cost factor is this pooling. So the whole business model or value add of insurance is this pooling capital, where you say you're covering lots of different risks across lots of different territories, and that means you need a smaller pot of capital to cover that, because you're diversified. And that is another kind of cost lever. But I think the big holy grail is that insurance companies incentivize risk reduction, and that because you're telling people to, make their houses disaster resilient, you'll get lower premium, etc. Though, if that could happen, I think that would really go a long way to reducing the overall cost.
Yeah, because then you motivate everyone. It's not just about motivating the government. You're motivating every single individual who's going to buy into the system, saying, you act more responsibly, and we reduce the cost.
Yeah, because you can't transfer risk indefinitely. There is a limit. And there is the limits of planetary boundaries around climate change. There are the limits of just, what capital markets are willing to absorb. And so you can transfer risk through insurance for a while, but if you aren't simultaneously creating the incentives, or as I like to call it, the breadcrumb trail, of getting people, governments, businesses, everyone who's sort of in this value chain to actually change their behavior, understand the economic cost of not adapting to and becoming more resilient to climate risk. If you can incentivize them to start putting in like investments in resilient infrastructure, investing in nature-based solutions, other things that are helping to bring down that risk and thus bring down the cost curve of those premiums, you're actually creating a more sustainable financial system that isn't just about transferring risks indefinitely because at some point you won't be able to transfer the risk. And it's also the point that we say it's not just about adapting to climate change, it's also making sure that you're incentivizing people to actually mitigate those risks and reduce the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere, and how do insurers, through their risk modeling expertise, help create the economic case for governments, individuals, businesses to do those investments.
And how do you see the willingness, right? If you can make I think that bringing the value for insurers, that you're actually saying, this is the cost, right? This is the price tag that's involved in this, and here are the different price tags if you use these different types of structures. How is the willingness actually to pay for this? Are we seeing, because when a disaster happens, people tend to be much more reactive to disaster than good about preventing disaster. Human nature, and this we've seen over and over again. But now disasters are becoming more and more frequent, and so you have more and more people that are affected by this. Are you seeing governments, cities, individuals actually reacting to this? And reacting to this not as in we should do something, but reacting to this as in we're bringing the money to the table and actually putting something there?
Well, I mean, I think yes, but in certain economies, I mean, we're working a lot in emerging countries, and there, even if there is a strong will, the financial constraints are very real because, I mean, there's a massive opportunity cost. Does the government subsidize an agriculture insurance scheme, or do they use that same money to invest in hospitals, schools, and true investment? So there is kind of a big compromise that they have to make with those kind of decisions. And I think the cause of a lot of the lack of insurance being bought is the political cycle. You've got 5-year windows, whereas the insurance is cost effective for, once in a lifetime kind of extreme events, or even once every 10, 20 years for the really, really catastrophic. That's where it's a
long-term investment.
And then
a short-term
so you don't have the political will to say, yes, we're going to pay premium every single year, and we probably won't ever see any benefit in my political life cycle. So it's really, really tough to match those durations, I think.
And insurance isn't for annual flooding. It's that tail end risk. It's that, so in some cities, you're having annual flooding. Insurance isn't going to cover that because it will just be the cost of the flood, because it's for that tail end risk.
We know what's happening.
Yeah, what's going to happen. It
insure.
happens every year. So it has to really cover, the extreme events, but the regular climate events are starting to be more extreme. So this is, again, where the risk reduction is really important, because insurers are never going to cover everything, because the cost of that would be astronomical. So you have to make it so that the extreme events are less extreme and less frequent, and that's, so that's where you kind of find this delicate dance. But as more people start having to pay for the impacts of this, you start seeing that demand pop up, or when they can't get insurance, and then that means that the entire cost of what they own is retained by themselves, whether that's a country or a city or an individual. If you can't get housing insurance, the entire value of your home is your financial responsibility. And if something happens to that, then that's on you, baby.
Yeah.
So, what does this mean practically? Yeah. We're starting to see a lot more interest, but
this goes back to the holy grail, which is the mitigation, and actually investing in mitigation and saying this is actually what needs to happen, because we're out of time. And we do it. But I think that it really brings it back to the fact that mitigation is really key, because otherwise eventually all of this, as things accelerate, and we know that they will continue accelerating, the more they accelerate, the less feasible it becomes for anybody to pay for this.
Especially the people who need it most, which are the people in developing countries who are really on the front line of these disasters.
And just to say, like, I know we've all talking about adaptation so much, but I think, as Lauren mentioned, if we did have, considering the short window of time we have to really act, I think the best adaptation measure we could be thinking about is actually mitigation, to reduce emissions as much as possible so that in the future, we can remove as much of the damage that's going to come as much as we can.
And with that, we close. Thank you, ladies, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
For coming. And
Do we leave? You stay? You leave? You stay?
no, I'll be right. I'm coming with you because today, now we have a special surprise.
Good talk.
Which will be coming to clear the stage because now we have a dance performance by Amelie Joannidis. And then we'll be back with the final panel on crisis management. Thank you. Welcome back to the talking. We just said this is a hard act to follow when you have a beautiful dance performance and then come and talk about death and destruction is true. So I am here, we're our last panel, with Caroline Holt, who is the Director of Disaster, Climate and Crisis at the IFRC. IFRC is the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent. For anyone who doesn't know, very big global operation. And she's been overseeing those global operations for 20 years, so she knows a lot about how disaster and crisis has evolved in the world. So maybe we start by what it is that you actually do at IFRC. What does the IFRC do? More.
What is the IFRC? Okay, well, thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. It's Friday afternoon, and we follow a beautiful ballet performance, and apologies for now bringing down the mood. But it's a very serious topic, of course, in terms of talking about climate. And at the IFRC, we're responsible for supporting 191 national societies globally. So we are a network of national societies. Many of you will know them. The French Red Cross is one. The British Red Cross is one, where I'm from. The Bangladesh Red Crescent is one. And there are 191 globally. Basically, we are community-based organizations, 180,000 branches globally, 16 million volunteers. So really embedded in community and supporting communities with the increasing frequency and intensity of the disasters and the crises that face them today. We've heard from the last two panels that that's becoming worse and worse in terms of, as I say, the frequency and the intensity. So having strong national actors who are there, who are prepared, who can support communities who are at the very front line of this extreme climate change is critically important to us.
And how is it, because as you said, there's clearly a big growth in the need for these kinds of disaster relief. How are you all adapting as an organization, and what do you see as the future coming in terms of where you need to be and what it is that you need to do to be able to actually properly address the kinds of crises that are the reality of today?
You're right, there's huge need. And if we just look at the statistics that we have that very much come from the communities that we support, 89% of what the Red Cross and Red Crescent responded to last year was to do with climate emergency, to do with extreme weather events, to do with supporting communities through floods, through droughts, through hurricanes, through cyclones. We need to make sure that we are engaging and supporting communities. We just also heard from others that, the needs are getting worse and worse. I feel like there's an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented at the minute in terms of records that are being broken. All the wrong records, by the way, that are being broken. Extreme heat, earlier hurricanes, more intense hurricanes than ever before in the season, record-breaking floodwaters. And it's not just limited, of course, to those places that are developing. It's not limited to anywhere. I think we're all seeing it and we're all touched. So as the world experiences more and more of this, we will need more stronger local actors such as Red Cross and Red Crescent. It will come from communities. The first responders are there in the community, and they need the support of good, strong local actors to help them. I think preparedness, it's been mentioned a couple of times already this afternoon, is absolutely key. That we support communities, that we support national actors, that we support Red Cross and Red Crescent societies to have what they need in the warehouses, to have the skills that they need, but also to support communities with this early warning, early action, understanding what it is to anticipate the crisis that is facing communities and understanding what it takes to support them so that they have the best chance of surviving with their lives and livelihoods.
And are you seeing actually that local communities are prepared? Is this working, these initiatives, to try and help strengthen the most important response system that there is?
Communities have always been resilient to a large extent. The whole notion of community is that people work together to overcome the challenges of life. So we do see a lot of resilience, but I think what we're seeing at the minute is the intensity and the frequency that's really challenging communities and taking them to the extreme. we're not seeing the funding necessarily and the resources required going to community level. And I think that's where we need collectively to advocate for those resources to get to community level so that they serve the people who need those resources most.
Yeah, and I think it's good if we talk about a little bit about the funding and what's actually happening on the funding front. We know that the US is withdrawing a lot on the international playing field, that other actors are also scaling back in response to what's happening with the US. What's happening with the financing?
I mean, the financing is becoming more and more difficult to prioritize along the lines of climate. As I say, 89% of what we responded to last year was climate related. Therefore, there's a lot of fatigue. There's a lot of stuff that is missing the headlines. There's a lot of responses going on, even today, floods, droughts, climate events that are not even getting anywhere near our television screens nor our media. And therefore, it's more and more important that communities have what they need so that they can respond, because these silent crises will still continue to happen. And we're not necessarily seeing that the urgency is there. There's a lot of priorities in the world right now. There's a lot of politics in the world right now. And the prioritization of funding where it's needed most to communities who are most vulnerable and at the front line of the climate emergency is not necessarily where we're seeing those resources being put.
No, there's a shift in priority. And I think we touched also on the last panel on a really important point, which is that financing, at least government financing, is linked to a short-term cycle. There's not a lot of long-term interest involved in this. Whereas managing, mitigating, preparing, giving local communities the resources and the tools and the ability to actually address climate change when it happens and these crises is really, it's disjointed.
Yeah.
So the funding doesn't come in that kind of a stream, and that makes it all the harder to plan long term.
Exactly, but I think there is some hope in there as well. It's always good to have a bit of hope on a Friday afternoon. But from the last panel, we heard about the role of insurance. Who'd have thought insurance and the humanitarian sector had such a role to play together? But this is a whole of society approach. And from our experiences at the IFRC, we last year, well, in the last 3 years, we've had a partnership with Aon Insurance that last year was triggered for the first time. It was an indemnity insurance policy that said as soon as certain triggers are activated, we will release insurance funding for communities under certain criteria to access funding available to them. And I think that's huge strides ahead in terms of where the private sector and the humanitarian sector really can explore opportunities. That particular insurance policy, let's say, was worth 14 million to vulnerable people in the world just last year. And it's a drop in the ocean in terms of need, but it's certainly a creative and innovative way as to how we are working together to try and find the resources that are needed where there's such a resource gap.
And do you think that's something that can be replicated in more places, having that kind of an insurance policy?
I would say so. The insurance policy that we work with is around climate events. I would like to see those insurance policies expanded for migration events, for things that we can foresee, for health and for epidemic events. And the way that we can broaden those by having serious conversations with the insurance sector will then allow us to leverage much more funding and much more resourcing for the people that really need it. So I'm very hopeful. I think the models are there. But also it's about understanding each other's priorities. I'm not naive to the fact that the insurance industry also needs to make a level of profit. They have shareholders to satisfy. In my world, we have recipients of our services and vulnerable people to support. And there clearly is a way that those two sectors can come together to hopefully come out with an outcome that satisfies all parties.
Well, and there needs to, I think we didn't talk about it so much, but the insurance industry to some extent has to adapt now, because otherwise they will eventually work themselves out of business. If things are getting bad enough, you have to adjust to the realities of the world today. It's not just about life insurance and home insurance now. It's about a much, much broader range of issues that need to be covered and need to be addressed, and it gives them, in my mind, a way to actually move forward as an industry. But that has to have some melding time to actually make it happen.
And I do
And
think
it
there's
sounds
a lot
like
of
it is.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Slowly.
positivity. And I think, let's break the climate emergency down because it's too big in some ways for people to know what it means. But we've heard examples just this afternoon about it means, do you have enough food to eat? Do you have a secure supply of food? Do you have a secure supply of safe drinking water? Do you have the means to move if your house is in the line of a direct flood? And it's really about understanding what people need and how they live their lives, and how the insurance industry can also support, or to be honest, how any partnership can support. We work with a number of partners, and again, it goes back to this whole of society approach that will get us to where we need to be. This isn't now just about, well, the Red Cross will deal with that. This has to be about how we are collectively engaging, supporting communities, how we're providing that training, how are you building community approaches into your business models, private sector. What does that look like in terms of making and building in resilience to the food supply chains and to the water supply chains? And if we have that collective approach together, I believe that we'll definitely move forward together.
And can you talk a bit to what kind of partnerships are happening? Are there particular countries or particular examples of places where this is working very well, of this partnership also bringing in the private sector and having them be part of the solution?
Yeah, well, there are a number of countries where partnership plays a critical piece in this. We have a long-standing relationship with Zurich Insurance as well, and it's not necessarily for an indemnity policy, but actually it's more about supporting and securing, making sure communities have the resources in advance, that we're investing in anticipatory action, so that communities have the resources so that they can move themselves out of harm's way, or that they can bounce back even quicker. And that, I believe, won't necessarily come from the global level, but I think that partnership is about communities and national partnership. And as I say, everybody sort of playing that holistic role around what it is to safeguard people's lives, their livelihoods, to ensure great standard, or at least a good standard of living for the global population.
And I'm just thinking about that. We had talked a bit about supply chain, and that actually a huge amount of the products that go into manufacturing, that go into all of the things that we buy, come from countries that are not well equipped to manage crisis. And so that it's also important for companies themselves to in some way secure their supply chains and secure that they're going to have this access to the products that they need. And in doing that what they're actually doing in an ideal world, and if they do it well, is mitigating risks and protecting populations from these kinds of climate disasters, or at least making sure that they're able to continue with their livelihood.
You're absolutely right. The supply chain is one aspect of it, but also consumers and customers need to also retain and maintain a certain level of income and standard of living to be the future customers of those markets. So this is where I think that we've not been smart enough to date in terms of bringing together that private sector profit-making understanding, that investment understanding, and then the lives and livelihoods of people all around the world. And as I say, this isn't about somebody in an African context that you've never met. This is climate that will and continues to impact us all. So I think the closer that we can get with the private sector, and the more that we can talk about innovative partnerships, the use of data, the use of AI, the use of technology to forecast events, the use of technology to keep people safe, and the use of technology for people to really build themselves back up again when disaster has struck. I think that's a really important part of the work that we need to do together.
There's a lot of work to be done there.
There's a huge amount.
And there was another figure that you brought that I think is really interesting, which is that $1 spent today is worth $7 once a disaster actually strikes. So how do you see that fitting in terms of the resources that are available, in terms of the partnerships? Is there more of a focus on the $7 when the disaster is struck, or are people actually buying into it makes sense to mitigate, it makes sense to spend the money now, because ultimately you're spending so much less money if you actually prepare properly, knowing that this will happen, but maybe that it's not going to be pinned on you when it does?
Exactly, and it's an example that we can bring back to our own lives, but it's a World Bank statistic that says $1 spent in advance, in preparation, in anticipation of a disaster is then worth the $7 you'll have to pay to clean up. And I think that that's known, it's a known fact. It's something that people absorb, and it's a fairly easy statistic, but it's still so difficult to sell that because you're selling an unknown to a certain extent. How do you sell something that hasn't happened to say, this won't happen if we invest? It's much easier, it's getting more difficult to get money when the pictures and the media and the news is in our face, showing us people who've been impacted by crisis across the world. Unfortunately, that's the way the world works at the minute, and the instinct to respond and to react is much stronger than the instinct to prepare and to plan. And I think that's where we also need to come together, and we need to continue to provide that evidence and show and tell those stories, more importantly, about people's lives who haven't been affected because we invested in advance and we understood and they trusted us and we worked together as a community and we saved all of that devastation following a particular disaster and crisis.
It's true that I've never ever heard a story of saying we were prepared and so we saved this amount of money. It's always talking about this crisis cost X amount of dollars because that was paid out. No one is looking at what's saved, or at least no one I'm aware of. And that would actually be a story that would be more convincing, to get people to actually be on board and to have the foresight. If you said, okay, this is the cost of doing it today, this is what you will have to pay later on, and here are the examples of what's happening. So in this kind of a society, if you know in this location there's a big risk of floods, here's a good example and here's a bad example.
Exactly.
Which one do you want to be?
Exactly.
Is there anyone actually doing that?
I mean, we do have that evidence. Let's talk about Bangladesh, because that was the example that we heard earlier. We know that investing in cyclone shelters has saved millions, hundreds of thousands of millions of lives over the last 10 years. But it's not an interesting story to many because the media isn't so dramatic. Yeah. It's a very interesting story to me. It's a very interesting story, no doubt, to people here who care about humanity. But the images are not as strong. And we need to get better at telling that story. We need to tell it in a very sincere way. And we need the people themselves who have benefited from cyclone shelters in Bangladesh, let's say, to tell that story about what life used to be like 15 years ago. And we've seen devastation and lives lost and livelihoods lost. And today, we know that we can predict, we know that we can get people and people can get themselves to safe spaces, and we know that we save lives. But unfortunately, we still have a media that reacts to drama and to image. So I'd like us collectively to tell that story and find that story just as interesting and really invest up front, because it will save us not only resources, it will more importantly than that save lives.
So we need a media that does a better job at telling the stories.
Possibly,
that are there.
Yes, possibly we do.
All right, and we have to wrap up for today. Do you have any words of hope? Because I feel like you're the positive flower at the end of this.
I mean, events like
cycle.
this, surely, events like this are hopeful. The number of people that are attracted to this story still. If you to turn on the news, you might believe that nobody is interested in climate anymore. But I think we need to make it real and we need to keep talking about it. Now more than ever, we need to lean into this as a topic and say it's still a climate emergency. Extreme weather events are impacting people and their lives on a daily basis. And tomorrow it could be me and you. And that, I think, is the story that we need to keep telling and keep the profile of the work that we do high.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed this session. I hope you leave hopeful, because it's
good.
Not the easiest topic, but we really appreciate your time. And enjoy the rest of Change Now.
Thank you.